Welcome to Mental Makeover Radio, your go to destination for meaningful conversations about mental health. I'm your host and your trusted therapist bestie, Cecilia Manella. Join us as we explore the complexities and messiness of human experience by addressing your questions and concerns. I'm here to provide a straightforward and practical therapy advice. So grab your favorite beverage, whether it's tea, coffee, or whatever tickles your taste buds, and get ready to embark on a mental makeover. On today's episode of Mental Makeover Radio, we're going to dive into the topic of grief. I know it's not a super sexy topic, and it's not one that gets really people that interested, but it's actually a topic that comes up so often. And all of my therapy sessions and my conversations with people is grief and loss and our struggle to really have a good framework for it. So, in today's episode, I'm going to share my personal perspective of grief and how I integrate that into my professional perspective through my own personal experiences of, grieving and being a young widow and processing grief in a way that has led to healing. So, I hope you stay tuned and join this conversation because it's all going to be about grief. So, I'm Cecilia Manella, and I am your host of Mental Makeover Radio, and I'm so glad that you're here. When you think about the word grief, what comes to mind? What emotions come up for you? I find that most people want to avoid grief and they do everything in their power and control to avoid it. And in fact, we are so uncomfortable with grief and grieving that we'll do anything to avoid it. So, the first step is really asking yourself the question of like, how comfortable am I with grief for myself, but also how comfortable am I holding space for others who are grieving? And you might have a bit of a different answer for both of those questions. You might find it easier to hold space for yourself while grieving, but really comfortable with other people's experience of it. Or quite the opposite, where it's much more comfortable to give support, to give love to somebody who's grieving than to allow yourself space for your own grief. Now, it's kind of this tricky thing. We view grief as I don't know, some kind of shameful experience. We like to keep it behind closed doors. We don't want to show too much emotion. We don't want to show the vulnerability of things. We try to like keep it under wraps. We like to put it in a pretty little box, put a bow on it, put it away, and move on with life. I hear that all the time. I just want to move on. But what if you could take a different approach to grief? What if your perspective was a little bit different? From my perspective, grief is a natural human experience. Now, being a human on this planet is so messy, and we love to try to control it. We love to control all the aspects of being a messy human. But the truth is, the harder we try to control, the more suffering we experience. So, grief is really messy. It's a really overwhelming feeling. It's a really overwhelming time in our lives where we feel like lots of things are out of control. And all we really want to do is find some piece of it that we can manage, a piece of it that feels like we can control it. So, in that way, we are kind of terrified of grief. So, we like to talk about grief in like stages. I hear this a lot, the 5 stages of grief and the research of, Kubler-Ross around the stages of grief. Now, there's a ton of value in that research and the information that comes from it. But it's really important to understand that the original research on grief that came out with stages by Kubler-Ross was done in interviewing people who are dying. It wasn't meant for the people who are left behind grieving. And so it was more about the process of grieving as you encounter death. She interviewed palliative patients, people who are at end of life stages, and about coming to terms with their own mortality and the fact that death was upon them. That's where the stages of grief come from. It wasn't really it wasn't investigated or researched on the people that are left behind. And so I think that as a Western culture, we're really confused when it comes to grief. We want to grasp on these, theories and approaches and understanding. So again, that we can put it into these time frames, we can put them into stages, wrap it all up in a pretty bow and put it away so we actually understand what it is. We are really uncomfortable with this idea that grief is just fucking messy. Like it just is. And sometimes there's no rhyme and reason for it. But my approach to it, and I hope that it actually changes your perspective just a little bit on grief, and maybe it allows space in your life if you are in grief to be more forgiving and more loving to yourself, is that we are built for grief. Okay, we are built for it. We know how to do it. So hang in with me on this one. The reason why I say that is because grief and love are two sides of the same coin. So they're not opposites. They're actually interconnected with each other and they actually rely on each other because we don't grieve what we don't love. We don't, we're not grieving people who die that we don't care about. And we don't grieve situations or futures or dreams that are lost to us if we didn't love them. So, love and grief are actually really intertwined and interconnected, and in some ways, kind of rely on each other. Because the reason why we love so deeply is because we know that our time in this loving relationship or circumstance we find ourselves in is actually quite limited. We know that it doesn't go on forever. So in our acceptance of this limited time frame that we have maybe with this person or a relationship or a job or whatever it is, we understand that it's limited. And in that limitation, we love. And so we know that grief is attached to that, the loss of something that we love. And the reason why I say that we're built for it is because if you've got little people in your life or have children in your life or have been around little people, and these, humans are just magically perfect little beings that are born into the world, is we don't really teach children how to love. I want you to really think about that. If you've raised your own children or you're in the midst of having children or been around children, we don't teach them how to love. We teach them how to walk, how to crawl, how to eat, how not to hit other people, how not to bite, how to use words. We teach them language, but we don't actually teach them the emotion of love. Their children are just this beautifully created, magical, little messy little human that knows how to love automatically. We don't have to teach bonding, it just happens. And so, in that, the fact that we are all born out of love and we know how to love really naturally means that we also know how to grieve because we just know. Our heart knows, our psyche knows, our mind knows. Whatever you believe in, our spirit, whatever you want to think about, whatever your faith is, whatever your belief is, our bodies know how to do this. What gets in the way is our preconceived notions that get taught to us about what it should be and what it should look like. Cultural expectations, gender expectations, societal expectations, family expectations, racial expectations, gender expectations, all of these systems around us that we all exist in, they create these preconceived notions of what it should look like. And then if you don't follow those rules that sometimes are changing all the time, then somehow you're doing it wrong. And to add to that, the psychiatric world, the world of psychiatry, has also added some limitations around grief in that we now have a diagnosable DSM mental health condition of complex grief if you are still grieving and feeling sad in an intense manner over 3 months. Now, I don't know about you if you've lost someone close to you or someone in your life has died, someone that you've had a really close relationship with, especially around a sudden death, one that took you by surprise. 3 months is a drop in the bucket when it comes to grieving. I can tell you from experience that when my husband died suddenly, 3 months was a drop in the bucket. I was lucky to be in a place 3 months out where I could confidently wake up every single day and take care of myself. So grief, it can be really debilitating. And it's again in relationship to love. And so this idea that we put timelines on grief is absolutely ridiculous. It makes zero sense to me. It's like we do not put limitations on love. So why are we putting limitations on grief? Because there's this concept that somehow we can't be in the world existing if we're in grief, as if we have to, everything pauses to grieve and then we unpause that, we're done with that, and then we move on with the rest of life. And we talk about grief that way. When we say things like, I need to move on, or someone says, I think you should move on, or haven't you grieved long enough? Hasn't it been long enough time? When are you going to get over this? You got to get over this. This idea that we put grief in this timeline, this structured timeline, and there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when it comes to an end, it's time to close that door and move on with life. This is how we talk about grief. But we don't talk about love this way. We can love to the end of time. We can love to the last breath that you take, you love people. And so grief is that way. Grief transforms over time. The intensity shifts, the challenges that come with it shift and change, but grieving exists for the rest of your life in relationship to love. So our love relationship with someone who has died changes because that relationship is frozen in time. In a way, it has a finite moment. You can't have a more ongoing conversations where the person actually speaks to you. You can't continue a relationship with them in the way that you can consult them. And you can say, like, what would my mom say about this situation? What would my grandpa say about the situation? What would my wife say about this? What would my husband say about this? What would my child say about this? Or, the people that have died in your life, you can consult them because they exist within inside of you. You carry that relationship, that wisdom, the experiences you've had with them, and you can consult them. But the relationship after somebody dies is somewhat frozen in time. And to think that somehow we put an endpoint on the love for that person is, again, ridiculous. So then why are we putting an endpoint when it comes to grief? So everyone's so terrified of staying stuck in grief. And I think we just don't spend enough time in it, actually. I think that we probably need to allow ourselves to step in it and stop being so scared of being stuck in it and really be more scared of moving on too fast. Because grief is kind of it's a finicky bastard. Like, it will follow you and it will be patient like you've never experienced anything else, and it will knock you flat on your ass when you least expect it. If you avoid grief, it will be patient. It will wait. So if you don't make space for it, eventually it will force you to make space for it. And so if you want to have a little bit of powerfulness or some control, is about making space for it, radical acceptance of grief from a place of love for yourself, and a place of love for what you have lost and who you've lost, who is no longer here. So this is a dynamic relationship that you have with grief, and its intensity is in the front end. And as you learn to live with it, as you learn to have space for it, it kind of calms down a little bit. And then you can kind of come to a place of a mutually engaging relationship with grief where you know that it's there and you make space for it. You don't fight it. You don't try to control it. You just allow it to be. It's a radical acceptance that grief is in relationship to love that you have for somebody. And we can lean into that because there's so many amazing gifts that come with grief. And I know that sounds like a little bit of an oxymoron to say that grief gives you a bunch of gifts. But from experience, the beginning of grief is absolutely devastating. And the depth of despair and pain and suffering is real. So I'm not discrediting that. And that is an experience we need to have because, again, it's in relationship to the love. And so the joy that comes with love, the flip side of that is the despair that comes with grief. And that's okay. In accepting this long relationship with grief, and I called it my non consensual arranged marriage with grief because I didn't want to be in this marriage. I didn't want to be in this relationship with grief. I didn't consent to it. It wasn't my choice. It just showed up one day. All of a sudden, grief was part of my life and I would have to grieve. And I could either fight it or surrender to it. And in surrendering to it, when I gave up the fight of trying to control it, trying to, put in a box, trying to coerce it and trying to negotiate it with it. And when I came to a place of absolute surrender, is when I really realized this is really about love and that I would have to deal with this for the rest of my life. And that if I made space for it, then it would have time to morph and change with me. And in that, there were lots of gifts. There were a lot of things that we realized in grief. And one of the greatest gifts of grief, and I do believe this is why we grieve in community, we grieve with other people and family and friends and people that we bring us together, is it's a reminder of our mortality. Ooh, and that's a heavy one. Because in today's day and age, we're so busy. We're so busy running around, taking the kids here and there, all the meetings and appointments and dinner dates and drinks, and our phones going off notifications and texting and social media and everything that we're being pulled into. We're so distracted that we actually are not contemplating mortality anymore. I mean, not that long ago, like 100 years ago, which is a drop in the bucket in the grand scheme of human history, 100 years is nothing. We had a lot of time for contemplation. We have no time for contemplation. We actually have to schedule time for contemplation, which is so utterly fucking ridiculous if you think about it. So, grief is a reminder of our mortality. And why do we want this? Why do we want a reminder of our mortality? You're like, Cecilia, this is so down and depressing. I don't want to think about dying. I don't want to think about death. I don't want to think about my mortality. It's really important to think about mortality because it's a reminder that our time here is limited. We're not here forever. No one gets out of this experience alive. We all are exiting at one point or another. That's just the truth. And when we come face to face with mortality and our that we're on this planet for a limited time, we are much more connected to the value of our time. We're much more connected to the richness of our relationships. We're much more connected to asking ourselves a question: am I happy? Am I content? Do I have joy in my life? Am I doing what I want to be doing? Am I doing what brings me contentment and settlement? Am I being the human being that I want to be on this planet? We come face to face with those questions. And that is a gift. That is a good thing. Grief stops us in our tracks, and it needs to. It is a wake up call that time is right now. Your life is happening right now. It's not happening in the future. Your life is not happening in the future. Your life is happening right now. And how are you managing that time? What are you doing in your life right now? What are your relationships like? One of the biggest gifts of grief are these questions, this moment, this pause to reflect on your own mortality and how you're showing up. The other gift of grief is the radical acceptance of boundaries. Like you really come to realize how much bullshit you put up with every single day. The people pleasing, the trying to meet everybody else's needs, the hustling for approval, the hustling for this and the hustling for that, the giving a shit about what your neighbors think or who thinks or this imaginary audience in your life and what they think. It's giving up on all that and just setting some really great boundaries to just say, I don't want that. I don't need that. But this is what I want. This is what I need. This is what I desire. These are my dreams. This is what I'm going to pursue. This is what I'm going to tolerate. And this is what I'm not going to tolerate anymore. I'm going to change the course of how I show up in my life because my time here on this planet is limited. I'm going to focus on my relationships. I'm going to show up in the way that I want to. I'm going to be the human being that I want to be. I'm going to live into my values. I want to leave a legacy of some sort. So another gift of boundary is about boundaries, is showing up in the way that you want to. The other gift of grief is this idea, because our time is limited, is what are we doing with love? What are we doing in our relationships? Are we coasting by? Or are we telling the people in our life who we love that we love them? Are we telling children in our life how special they are, how unique they are to us, their strengths that we see? Are we telling our parents that we care about them, or our aunts or uncles or grandparents, our spouse, our boyfriend or girlfriend, whoever it is? Are we telling these people that we love them? We are not really meant to be here to work every single day and then just die. Like I just can't wrap my head around that. I refuse to believe that we have to have a greater purpose here than besides going to school, getting a job, to get a paycheck, to buy all the things, to get to retirement, and then to die. I mean, really, if you think about it, it's kind of really sad. There has to be more. I fundamentally believe that we're here to enjoy our life, to have rich, loving relationships, to feel that connection, to feel that love. And grief can be a reminder to take inventory of your relationships. Are they healthy for you? Are they loving? Are they reciprocal? Are you showing up in the way that you want to in those relationships? Are you showing up as a human being that you want to in those relationships? Do you tell them that you love them enough? Do you show that love? Do you have some work to do around that? Are you scared of vulnerability? Like, you need to start exploring these things. Grief is such a great gift to explore all of these pieces of yourself. And I think that's really, really, really important. So when we try to put grief into stages, we're not talking about those things. We are talking about a way to just check the steps and get to the side. And we're not really exploring how grief changes us and how it should change us. It's supposed to change us. It's supposed to be transformational. Or else, like, what's the point? What is the point? So, grief can't be put in a box. He doesn't like that. It's a relationship that you have with grief. And it's lifelong. People grieve for the rest of their life because you love that person for the rest of your life. And this experience of grief is the same when we're talking about an ending of a marriage. We talk about divorce. We talk about losing your job, friendships that come to an end, relationships that come to an end, opportunities, dreams that are coming to an end. Grief is attached to those things too. It's not just about the death of a person, but it's the death of an idea, the death of a future you thought you would have, the death of a dream that you thought would come true, the death of a goal that you were working towards that you no longer get to. There's grief attached to those things too. And the process is exactly the same. It's radical acceptance around making space for grief, acknowledging it, and just basically saying, if I'm grieving, it means I'm human. And that is wonderful. That means I have feelings, and that's great. Because I loved this person, this thing, this future, and I've lost that. It's died. So there's grief attached to that. And you may grieve it forever. Now, will the intensity change? Yes. I hear all the time, if I start crying, I'm going to cry forever. I'm never going to stop. Trust me, your body cannot cry forever. It will always come to a place of stopping. There's a intensity, it peaks, you come down from the peak, and there's a release that comes with that. It will stop. Trust me. The intensity of the front end of grief will not last forever. A lot of people will say, if I make space for it, what if it's just intense like this, a 10 out of 10 all the time? And it's a justifiable fear. I understand that. But the truth is that it won't be 10 out of 10 forever. And that when you do make space for it, the intensity starts to decrease almost immediately. There's almost a reassurance like, oh, there's space for me here. It's okay. I don't have to get your attention. I don't have to poke at you anymore. I'm here and that's okay. And over time, the grief evolves and changes. And a lot of people will say, well, time heals. It only takes time. No, it's not just about time. It's about allowing space for grief. And over time, in this space that you've created for grief, it will ebb and flow. The intensity will change year after year, month after month. The intensity will change. The triggers will be different year to year. Whether you're a year out from somebody dying or a divorce to 5 years out, to 8 years, to 10 years, the triggers will be different. The emotional ups and downs might be a little bit different. But grieving is lifelong because, again, it's attached to love. And there may be moments when you forget about grief and then we feel guilty about it. Somehow that if I kind of forgot about grief, then somehow it means I forgot that I love this person. And that's not what that means. That means there's an integration of it. That it's not this thing that's existing that feels foreign, but it's integrated into your story of who you are. And that's a good thing. And you will have memories, and that's okay. And sometimes you're going to cry, and that's okay too. Some days you're going to feel really sad, and some days you're going to feel okay. And all of those things are okay because love is messy. Is not linear. If you think about loving somebody or falling in love with somebody, it's not linear. It's so messy. It's all over the place all the time. And this is what we love about love is that it's got this element of messiness to it. And you know what? Grief is exactly the same. It's not linear. It's kind of messy, and that's okay because they're both related to each other. So I hope this conversation has helped you shift your perspective just a little bit, to be a little bit more open, to be more compassionate to yourself and to others, to see the beauty that can come from grief because it is related to love. Like we see the beauty in love. And so we can see the beauty in grief. The reminder that we're just messy humans trying to make sense of this experience. And it's okay that it's messy. That we can grieve people, but we can also grieve futures and experiences and relationships and anything we can grieve. And if we just give ourselves permission to feel how we feel when we feel it, it will allow there to be space. It's like moving water. If you try to dam it up, it becomes really, really problematic. It's really exhausting to dam up, let's say, a river that's flowing. But if you just let the water flow and go with the flow of it, it's a lot easier. You're not fighting so much. You have to trust yourself, your heart, your body, your mind, your soul, that you know how to love and therefore you know how to grieve. So you just got to get out of your own way. I hope you found today's episode helpful. And if you think someone else would benefit from it, please share this episode with them. I know that there's lots of us that have struggled through grief and would really like to hear a different perspective than what's out there. Thank you again for being part of the Mental Makeover community. Until next time, be bold, be brave, be well.